Mr. Watson here, and in this video we're going to look at periodization. Now this is probably going to be the longest video of this series, but this rounds up the principles of training. So the first thing we need to do, there are some definitions that we need to know. So I'm not going to read them out, you can just take a look and make notes. So we have periodization itself, macrocycle, Mesocycle, Microcycle, and tapering. So if you want to jot these down, you can just pause here. However, I will be talking about these later in the video. So, periodization. Periodization is the organized division of training into specific blocks. Each block is known as a cycle and has a specific goal and time frame. So we have the macrocycle. Now this is typically a 1 year cycle. However, it can be flexible and last up to 4 years for those Olympic athletes, which would be known as a megacycle. However, the coaches like to keep 1 year cycles so that they can make training specific and achievable. We have the mesocycle, which is typically 4 to 16 weeks. And the microcycle typically lasting 1 week, possibly 2 or 3. Now, why do we have periodization? There's 3 aims. 1, a performer reaches their physiological peak at the correct time. 2, they avoid injury and burnout. 3, training is structured to give realistic and achievable goals. So this is the overall aims of periodization. Let's take a look at the macrocycle. So as I've just mentioned, this is typically 1 year. Okay, so it can be flexible and last between 6 months to 4 years. However, a 4-year macrocycle can be very hard to plan specific training. So typically they're 1 year because, or even with Olympic athletes, there's still the national championships, world championships, and qualifying to do. So there are goals that need to be achieved within that. So 1 year is typically your macrocycle. Like I said, this is a long-term goal set out for the year. And an example of this would be a personal best in the end of season competition or the qualifiers, or if the big Olympics is within that year. So a macrocycle can be broken down into several mesocycles. So a mesocycle, typically 4 to 16 weeks. This depends on the phase of training the performer is in. So, as we'll see later in the video, your mesocycle has a specific name, a specific phase, and depending on that phase will depend on how long the cycle lasts. That's why it's pretty wide ranging from 4 to 16 weeks. This is your mid-term goal. So an example of that would be maintaining general fitness over a transition phase or the off-season, which we've mentioned in reversibility. So this is your mesocycle. So the duration will depend on the phase of training. So that will become clearer later in the video. Now, a mesocycle is broken down into several microcycles. So your microcycles are progression over 1 to 3 weeks. So they're a much smaller cycle, and it's better for short-term goals. Within the microcycle, you'll look at splitting your sessions and focus on specific units, such as skill-based practices or flexibility training. So you split it up into your training sessions and get really specific with what you want to achieve. So as I've mentioned with flexibility, it might be a short-term goal. Another example of a short-term goal might be simply you've done all your track work and now you're going to focus on perfecting the sprint start technique. Okay, a microcycle is broken down into several training sessions. So this is what it looks like overall. Now obviously the scaling is a little bit different, but it gives you the overall idea of how periodization looks, with your macro cycle lasting the longest, then meso, then micro, and then your individual training sessions. So now we're going to take a look at the phases. So this comes down to the designing of each mesocycle. It depends on the phase of training a performer is in within their year. So there are main seasons within the periodized year. This starts with the preparatory phase, which breaks down into two, the competitive phase, which also breaks down into two, and finally we have the transition phase. Okay, so going to look at these in a little bit more detail. So preparatory phase 1, these are known as off-season and pre-season. So phase 1 is the off-season. So this is where general conditioning takes place to develop that base to build upon within pre-season. Again, what I mentioned about in the James Milner example in the reversibility principle. So this will usually consist of aerobic training, mobility training, and strength and conditioning. Phase 2. So this is pre-season. So you've just gone from the off-season and you naturally build in to pre-season training. So progressive overload is applied here and the intensity of the training is increased. Okay, so sport-specific fitness becomes central as you're preparing for your season. So, for example, if your games such as basketball and football are played at a high intensity, you're going to now introduce anaerobic work in your pre-season. Okay, so you're looking to get the heart rate up, increasing that intensity. And as the competition season gets closer, this is reduced and competition-specific training will take over. So at the start of pre-season, you might do a lot of high-intensity aerobic and anaerobic work. But as the season gets closer, competition season, you'll start to do a lot of practice matches, pre-season friendlies as they're known. And they're still designed to work on the fitness, but you're bringing about more sport-specific skills. Okay, or it would be known as the sprint start in athletics, for example. So then we move into competition season and we have competitive phase 3. So this is where training load reduces and you start to take a look at tactics. Okay, now although tactics becomes the focus, if you have endurance performers, you'll still need to keep high intensity training. It just might not be as frequent to include them tactical sessions. Okay, it's also important to have adequate rest days so that you can maintain fitness levels and remain injury free so that you can actually play in the competition. So like I've said, endurance performers such as footballers, their training will still be at a high intensity as that matches the environment that they play their games in. So they couldn't reduce that intensity, otherwise they just simply wouldn't be match sharp. So they'll keep their anaerobic work lasting in high intensity interval training sessions. And then this allows them to be competition ready, fast reaction times, explosive power to bring about the result they want from the game. So this is competitive phase 3. Competitive phase 4 is known as tapering. So tapering is commonly used in athletics, specifically for long distance runners. And this is about bringing relief to the body. So 2 to 3 weeks prior to performance, training load is gradually reduced and relief is increased to ensure a performer is fully recovered with maximum fuel stores. Now, a common nutritional strategy is carbo loading. A marathon runner would initially start with a lot of distance work, getting the distance up. So then they start to look at the pace they want to run that distance. And as it gets closer to race day, they need to ensure that them glycogen stores are full. So they'll start to reduce their training and include more relief and rest days where they will maximize their fuel stores. Now, so in games players or other players, intensity, as we've just mentioned in competitive phase 3, that's maintained, but the volume will be decreased. So in pre-season training, in the preparatory phase, you might be training 4, 5, 6 times a week, and this might be reduced to 2 or 3 times during the season where you have fixtures at the weekend. So intensity is maintained, but volume is decreased by approximately 1/3. And our final phase is the transition phase. So the transition phase is the phase before the off season. So if we look at the transition phase like a cool down from a standard training session, this is gradually bringing your body back down to a state with low intensity work, and you're not just completely stopping your season, you're just enjoying some nice low intensity work. Again, not building a base, but just keep ticking over, and it's used as an active rest season at the end of a long hard season. And you'll also receive treatment on any injuries that you may have picked up through the season. And in the transition phase, this is when you will receive this and make sure that you're fully recovered as you transition into the off season. So as the preparatory phase approaches, training load will gradually increase again, and you'll go from low intensity work to moderate intensity, building up that base. Okay, so this is periodization. Like I said, a longer video, so just feel free to pause when you are, make notes, and it's also from page 84 in your books. Okay, thank you.